There are questions that change nothing, and there are questions that change everything, and the terrible part is you never know which kind you're asking until it's already out of your mouth. Micah Alvarez had asked Dev Oka for 1,000 small questions in the 4 months they'd shared a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat in Portland. Did you eat? Whose turn is it for dishes? Can I borrow your charger? And none of them had cracked anything open. They were roommates. They were friends, maybe, in the loose way two men in their late 20s become friends when life keeps putting them in the same kitchen at midnight. Then one night, 3 beers into a conversation that had wandered somewhere either of them planned, Micah asked something he didn't mean to ask out loud. He meant to think it. He meant to let it die quietly in his own head, the way he'd let so many other thoughts about Dev die quietly over the past 4 months. Instead, it left him. And Dev didn't laugh. Didn't deflect. He just looked at Micah for a long moment, like he was deciding whether to answer the question that was actually asked, or the one underneath it. This is the story of what happened after. Micah Alvarez had never planned on living with a stranger from the internet, but rent in Portland had a way of making decisions for you. He'd found the listing on a roommate matching site 3 days after his engagement ended being a generous word for what actually happened, which was that Renee had sat him down at their kitchen table and told him, gently, that she didn't think he'd ever really let her all the way in, and she deserved someone who would. He hadn't argued. That was the part that scared him. He hadn't argued at all. The apartment above the laundromat on Fremont Street was the 4th place he looked at, and it was Dev who opened the door, tall, unhurried, wearing a paint-stained flannel and the kind of calm expression that made Micah instantly aware of how wound up he was by comparison. "You're early," Dev said, not unkindly. "Sorry. I can wait outside." "No, come in. I just wasn't expecting punctuality from a guy whose profile picture is him falling off a paddleboard." Micah had laughed before he could stop himself, and something in his chest had loosened for the first time in 3 weeks. Dev worked restoring furniture out of a shop 2 blocks away, taking pieces other people had given up on, and coaxing the good wood back out from under decades of varnish and neglect. He talked about it the way some people talked about music. Micah, who spent his days doing structural engineering assessments on aging bridges, found he liked listening to someone talk about fixing things that weren't made of steel and calculation. They signed the lease within the week. The first month was ordinary. They developed the small rituals that turn a shared address into a shared life: Sunday grocery runs, a running argument about whose turn it was to deal with the dishwasher that never actually got resolved, a shelf in the fridge that was unofficially Dev's for the growing collection of hot sauces Micah was slowly, secretly starting to like. Micah did not notice, at first, that he'd started listening for the sound of Dev's key in the door before he admitted to himself he was listening for anything at all. It was October before Micah understood what he was doing, and he understood it in the stupidest possible way, standing in the hallway at 11 at night, laundry basket on his hip, watching light spill out from under Dev's door and thinking, with a clarity that scared him, "I hope he's still awake." He knocked before he could talk himself out of it. Dev was sitting cross-legged on his bed, sanding down a small wooden box by lamplight, sawdust dusting his forearms. "You're supposed to be doing your 10 p.m. bridge collapse spiral in the living room," he said without looking up. "That's the arrangement. I finished early collapsing bridges." Micah leaned in the doorway. "What's that?" "Present for my sister. She's turning 30 and having what she calls an identity crisis, so I'm making her a box to put crisis-related objects in. That's either the nicest or the strangest gift I've ever heard of. With my family it's usually both." Dev finally looked up, and something about the lamplight, or the late hour, or 4 months of small ordinary evenings, made Micah stay in the doorway a beat too long instead of saying goodnight. "You can come in, you know," Dev said. "You don't have to conduct all our conversations from doorframes." Micah came in. He sat on the floor with his back against the bed frame while Dev sanded, and they talked, not about anything important, just the loose unspooling kind of talk that happens when 2 people have run out of small talk and haven't yet found the nerve for anything bigger. Dev told him about growing up the only boy among 4 sisters in a house that never had a quiet corner. Micah told him, carefully, About Renee, about the strange shame of being left for a reason he couldn't argue with. Did she say why she thought that? Dev asked. That you don't let people in? She said I answer questions instead of feeling them. Micah picked at a thread on his jeans. She wasn't wrong. I've been doing it my whole life. Ask me something hard and I'll give you a very reasonable, very complete answer that has nothing to do with what I actually feel. That sounds exhausting. It's efficient. Those aren't the same thing. Dev set down the sandpaper. For what it's worth, I don't think you do that with me. Not always. Micah looked up at him, and for one unguarded second neither of them looked away, and the room felt smaller than it had a minute ago, and Micah's pulse did something inconvenient and undeniable. Then Dev cleared his throat and picked the sandpaper back up, and the moment folded itself away like it had never happened, though both of them would think about it for days. Winter came in sideways, the way it did in Portland, more rain than snow, more gray than dark. Micah's work sent him out to inspect a bridge 2 hours south for 3 days, and he came home Thursday night to find Dev had left the porch light on and a plate of food covered on the counter, still faintly warm, with a note that just said you always forget to eat when you're stressed. D. He stood in the kitchen holding the note longer than a note like that should require, and admitted to himself, in the particular quiet of an empty apartment, that he was falling for his roommate in a way that had stopped being deniable sometime around the wooden box. The admission didn't come with relief. It came with dread, because Dev had never once said anything, done anything, given him a single unambiguous sign that this wasn't entirely one-directional, and Micah had exactly one data point on how it went when he let someone matter this much and turned out to be wrong about what they wanted from him. He decided, with the particular stubbornness of a man protecting himself from further proof of his own inadequacy, to bury it. He was moderately successful for about 6 weeks. Then came the night that started with beer and ended with a question. It was a Friday in December. They'd both had rough weeks. Dev's shop had lost a major restoration client, Micah's firm had flagged an error on a report that wasn't technically his fault but landed on his desk anyway, and they ended up on the couch with a 6-pack between them, watching nothing in particular, talking about everything except what either of them was actually thinking about. Can I ask you something? Dev said somewhere around beer number 3. And you don't have to answer if it's, I don't know, too much. Sure. Have you ever been serious about a guy? Before Renee, I mean, or I never actually asked. I just assumed some things and never checked if they were true. Micah's heart did something complicated. I dated a guy in college. 2 years. It ended badly, not because of anything either of us did wrong, just bad timing and worse communication. I never really told my family. Renee knew. It wasn't a secret, exactly. It just never came up with most people. Why not? Because most people don't ask. Micah turned the bottle in his hands. You've never asked either. 4 months. I didn't think it was mine to ask. Dev's voice had gone quieter. I figured you'd tell me if you wanted me to know something like that. I think I wanted you to ask. The words were out before Micah fully weighed them, and he felt his face go hot, and he almost reached for the reasonable, complete, feeling-free answer that Renee had accused him of hiding behind his whole life. Instead, he asked the question that changed everything. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even really about Dev's love life, not exactly. It was smaller and stranger than that. A half-formed thing about curiosity and closeness and the particular ache of wanting someone you're not sure wants you back, and it slipped out sideways, unplanned, the way true things do when you've had just enough beer to stop guarding the door. Dev went very still. Why are you asking me that? He said, and his voice wasn't angry. It was careful, the way you talk when you think the ground might not hold your weight. I don't know, Micah said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and for a second the whole 4 months sat between them on the couch like something finally visible. Yes, you do, Dev said quietly. Micah looked at him. Yeah. I do. Neither of them said anything else that night. Dev got up, rinsed his bottle, said goodnight in a voice that gave away nothing, and went to his room. Micah sat on the couch for a long time afterward, certain he just ruined the best thing in his life by finally being honest about it. The days that followed were the longest of Micah's year. Not cruel, Dev wasn't cruel, had never once been cruel, but careful, in a way that felt worse than anger would have. They passed each other in the hallway with polite, deliberate space. The dish duty argument, which had always been half a joke, went quiet. The kitchen, which had been the site of 100 small unremarkable evenings, became a room they took turns in instead of shared. On day 4, Micah found the wooden box on the kitchen table, finished now, sanded smooth and rubbed with oil until the grain glowed. A note underneath, in Dev's handwriting: "Never sent this to my sister. Kept overthinking whether it was good enough." Maybe that's a theme with me. Micah read it 4 times before he understood it wasn't only about the box. He found Dev in the workshop 2 blocks away that evening, after hours, the only light in the building coming from the lamp over Dev's bench. Dev looked up when the bell over the door rang, and didn't look surprised, which told Micah he'd been half expecting this. "I owe you an explanation," Micah said, for the question. "For putting it on you the way I did instead of just saying the actual thing." "So say the actual thing." Micah's mouth went dry. He'd rehearsed something on the walk over and it had evaporated the second he saw Dev's face in the lamplight. "I like you," he said instead, plain and unpolished, the least reasonable and least complete answer he'd given anyone in years. "Not roommate-like. Not friend-like. I've liked you since October, maybe before, and I didn't say anything because the last time I let someone matter this much, I found out I'd never actually let her see me, and I was terrified of doing the same thing to you, being right next to you every day and still somehow keeping you out. That night the beer just took the wall down before I meant it to." Dev set down the chisel he'd been holding. "You know what I'd been doing for 4 days? Being furious with me, from the general vibe. Being furious with myself." Dev came around the bench, slow, like he was working up to something. "Because I've felt the same thing since maybe November, and every time I got close to saying it I told myself I was imagining it, because you just had your whole life rearranged by somebody leaving, and the last thing you needed was your roommate complicating it further. So I sat on it. I got good at sitting on it. And then you finally said something real, and instead of meeting you there, I went quiet and made you think you'd broken something. Did I? No." Dev was close now, close enough that Micah could see the sawdust still caught in the fine hair at his wrist. "You didn't break anything. You found the thing I've been too careful to say." "What thing?" Dev didn't answer with words. He answered by closing the last of the distance between them, slow enough that Micah had every chance to step back and didn't, and the first time Dev Okafor kissed him it tasted like the whole 4 months finally arriving somewhere. The weeks that followed were, in Micah's private accounting, the best of his adult life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything ordinary suddenly had weight. The Sunday grocery runs became something they looked forward to instead of scheduled around. The unofficial hot sauce shelf in the fridge became, without discussion, an officially shared shelf. Dev started leaving small things around the apartment that told Micah he was being thought of even when they weren't in the same room. A good pen left on Micah's desk the morning of a big presentation, a book on bridge history he'd found at a used shop, tucked into Micah's bag without comment. They were careful with each other in the good way now, not the guarded way. Micah found himself doing the thing Renee had accused him of never doing, sitting in a hard feeling instead of engineering his way around it, because Dev had a way of waiting him out without pushing, patient as sanding down old varnish, trusting the good wood was under there somewhere. "You don't have to have the perfect answer," Dev told him one night, when Micah started to explain, with excessive precision, why a bad day at work had rattled him more than it should have. "You can just say it was a bad day, and you don't fully know why yet. That feels like cheating." "It's not cheating. It's just true before it's organized." Dev pulled him closer on the couch. "I like you unorganized. I like the parts you haven't figured out yet." It was the first time in his life anyone had said that to Micah and meant it, and he believed him, because Dev had never once given him a reason not to. They didn't tell many people at first, not out of shame, but because the thing between them felt new enough that it seemed better protected in a small circle before it went out into the wider world. Dev told his sisters, one at a time, over the course of a month. The identity crisis sister, the one the box had been meant for, cried happy tears over the phone and demanded to meet Micah immediately. Micah told 2 close friends and eventually, his mother, who took it better than he'd braced for and worse than he'd hoped. Not rejection, just the slow work of a parent recalibrating a picture of her son's future. Through all of it, Dev was steady. Through all of it, Micah kept discovering that being fully known by someone didn't feel like exposure. It felt like relief. The trouble, when it came, didn't come from either of them. It came from Micah's father. Micah had put off the conversation for 3 months, telling himself he was waiting for the right moment, though he suspected there wasn't going to be one. His father was a practical man, a retired contractor who measured most things in terms of what held up and what didn't, and Micah had spent 30 years reading his moods well enough to know, before he even opened his mouth at Sunday dinner, that this wasn't going to go the way it had gone with his mother. It didn't. His father didn't yell. That almost would have been easier. He went quiet in a way that filled the whole kitchen, said something about needing time, and left the table before dessert. The silence that followed lasted weeks. Not a slammed door, just a long, cold absence where a relationship used to be. Micah didn't tell Dev how badly it had hollowed him out, not at first. He came home those nights and was careful and competent and fine, the old habit reasserting itself exactly when he needed it least, until Dev, who had learned him well enough by now to read the difference between quiet and fine, sat down across from him one night and simply said, "Tell me the real version." So Micah did. All of it. The silence at the table, the fear that he'd cost his father something that couldn't be repaired, the older fear underneath that one, that he was, at bottom, the kind of person people eventually decided wasn't worth the complication. "You're not," Dev said when he'd finished. "You're worth it. I need you to actually hear that, not just answer around it." "I hear it," Micah said, and for once didn't reach for a more complete sentence to hide behind. "It's just going to take me a while to believe it all the way through." "That's allowed." It was Dev, in the end, who suggested Micah give his father room instead of forcing resolution, and it was Dev who sat with him on the hardest nights without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed on a timeline. Micah understood watching him that this, the staying, the patience, the refusal to flinch from someone else's fear, was its own kind of love, quieter than the wooden box and just as considered. His father came around, eventually, in his own slow and imperfect way, a phone call in March that didn't apologize outright but asked, haltingly, whether Dev might want to come to dinner sometime. It wasn't everything. It was enough to build on, and Micah had learned by then that enough to build on was usually where real things started. The second conflict was harder, because it had no villain in it at all, just 2 good futures pulling in different directions. In April, the furniture shop where Dev worked was bought out by its owner's son, who wanted to modernize the business into something closer to a design studio, and offered Dev a position running a new restoration branch, in Seattle, 3 hours north, starting in September. It was the opportunity of Dev's career. It was also, unmistakably, a decision that would end the daily shape of the life they built. "I haven't said yes," Dev told him, the night the offer came, sitting at the kitchen table with the letter between them like something that might go off. "But you want to." "I want a lot of things. I want the job, and I want you, and for about 6 hours today I let myself believe I could have you as easily long distance as I have you right now, and I don't actually believe that." "Not really." Micah felt the old fear rear up, the fear that had driven him to bury his feelings for 6 weeks, the fear that any real thing he wanted would eventually be taken from him, or he'd fail to hold on to it. He recognized it this time, though, for what it was, instead of letting it drive. "I'm not going to ask you to give up the best opportunity of your career to keep things convenient for me," he said. "That's not what this is supposed to be. And I'm not going to take it if it means losing this," Dev said. "So we're at an impasse, apparently, of 2 people who refuse to let the other one make the sacrifice." They didn't solve it that night. They sat with it for weeks, the unresolved shape of it hanging over ordinary evenings, and Micah, who had spent his whole life answering hard things instead of feeling them, made himself sit inside the discomfort instead of engineering a tidy solution just to make it stop. What they eventually built wasn't a compromise so much as a choice made honestly, from strength instead of fear. Micah's firm, it turned out, had a satellite office in Seattle that had been trying to poach him for a year. He hadn't taken it seriously before, because taking it seriously would have meant admitting how much of his life planning had quietly reorganized itself around a man he told himself, back in October, was just a roommate. "I don't want you to move for me," Dev said, when Micah floated it. "I want you to move because you want to, not because you're scared of losing me if you don't." "I know the difference," Micah said, and meant it. "I looked at the offer before I knew about yours. I've been sitting on it for 2 months because I didn't know how to bring it up without it sounding like exactly what you're worried about. And now? Now I'm telling you it's not that. It's a good job, in a city I'd want to live in even if this whole thing with you had never happened, and it happens to also be the city you're about to move to, and I'm done pretending that's not something I want." It wasn't a fairy tale resolution. It was two adults choosing each other on purpose, with open eyes, aware of the risk and taking it anyway, which Micah had come to understand, over the past year, was the only kind of resolution that actually held. They moved to Seattle in September, into a smaller apartment with worse light and a much better view, and Dev's new studio opened that October with a piece in the front window that he built himself, a restored oak cabinet, the grain glowing the way the little wooden boxes had. The first thing customers saw when they walked in. Micah's father did come to dinner that winter, awkward and trying, and it went well enough that a second dinner followed it, and then a third, until awkward trying quietly became something closer to normal. On the 1-year anniversary of the question, the real one, the accidental sideways one that had cracked 4 months of careful silence wide open, they were back on a couch, this one in a new apartment in a new city, and Dev brought it up first. "You never actually told me why you asked it that way," he said. "The night with the beer. You could have just said you liked me. You went around 3 corners to get there." Micah thought about it honestly, the way he'd been practicing all year, sitting in the true answer instead of engineering the reasonable one. "Because I think some part of me already knew the real question underneath it, the one about whether you could ever actually want me, all the way, once you really knew me. And I wasn't brave enough to ask that one directly. So I asked something smaller, and hoped you'd hear the bigger thing anyway." "I did hear it," Dev said. "I just needed a few days to believe I was allowed to answer it." "And now?" Dev didn't answer with a reasonable, complete sentence either. He answered the way he had in the workshop that first night, by closing the distance, unhurried and certain, in a kiss that still, a year later, tasted like the truth finally arriving somewhere it could stay. Outside, Seattle rain traced the window in long unbroken lines, and neither of them reached to close the curtains, because some things, the good ones, the true ones, were worth being seen in. The question that started it all had never really been about anything small. It had been, from the very first accidental word of it, a question about whether Micah was allowed to want something all the way and keep it. A year later, on a couch in a city neither of them had planned on, with a man who had never once looked away from him, he finally had his answer. "Yes."